Classic arcades possessed a very influential role in the history of gaming. The late 70s to mid-80s, or what is known as the golden age of arcades, remains a fond memory in the minds of those who got to experience them. Nothing was more exciting than entering the smoke-filled rooms with a handful of quarters, while flashing bright lights emitted from the countless arcade machines. People would spend hours playing classic games like Pac-Man, Space Invaders, and Donkey Kong. As the introduction of home consoles became more widely available, this era slowly faded away. Now, there are very few classic arcades left. The golden age of arcades left not only happy, vivid memories behind, but also some chilling legends. You may be familiar with some of these, such as the legend of Polybius, the alleged government mind control game. But there is one legend that stands out, mainly because of how much of it is based on true events. The first game to ever be associated with the death of its players, Berzerk. Berzerk was released in 1980 by Stern Electronics. The game was simple. The player controlled a green stickman character and had to navigate through a series of maze-like rooms filled with robots who would shoot lasers at the player. The goal was to travel from room to room, annihilating every robot possible to rack up points. The player would lose a life if they were shot by a robot, ran into a robot, or ran into a wall. The iconic villain of the game was a character named Evil Otto. Although innocent-looking, Evil Otto's purpose was to speed up the game by making an appearance if the player lingered in a room for too long. Otto could phase through walls and would relentlessly follow the player around until they entered a new room. Being touched by Otto would result in the loss of another life. Frustratingly enough, there was no way to kill Evil Otto. One thing that stood out about this game was that it was one of the first of its kind to use speech synthesis. The robots had a 30-word vocabulary they would generate during certain instances.
Attack the humanoid. Intruder alert, intruder alert.
The implementation of this is estimated to have costed Stern Electronics $30,000. The game's use of speech synthesis, however, would not be the full reason for why this game is remembered how it is today. The story takes a turn with the events surrounding the death of an 18-year-old kid named Peter Bukowski. Bukowski was a pretty normal kid. He was 5'10", weighed around 170 pounds, and had no prior medical conditions. All around, he seemed like a physically healthy person. His pastimes consisted of him hanging out with his friends, girlfriend, and he frequented a nearby arcade called Friar Tuck's Game Room. According to Tom Blankley, former owner of the arcade, Bukowski spent most of his time here playing Berzerk. On April 3rd, 1982, however, something happened that nobody was prepared for. On this cold night, Bukowski made his way to Friar Tuck's Game Room at around 8 o'clock p.m. after hanging out with one of his friends. Like always, he made his way toward the Berzerk machine and blasted away at the virtual robots. Within 15 minutes, he had played 2 games, both of which were high scores. After entering his initials into the machine following the second game, he collapsed in front of the machine. An ambulance was called, and Bukowski was rushed to the hospital where he was pronounced dead on arrival. As rumors of his death spread, people began blaming the game for his death. Some arcade owners even removed the game from their building. Of the many rumors that arose from Peter Bukowski's death, one of the most popular connected the smiley face water towers in the city with the unyielding enemy of Berzerk, Evil Otto. They say that Evil Otto has the paranormal ability to influence people outside the game, causing death to them for various reasons. As this legend gained traction, another story came to light of another victim of Evil Otto, Jeffrey Dailey. The death of Jeffrey Dailey is alleged to have happened before the Peter Bukowski incident. According to ArcadeHistory.com, Dailey was playing Berzerk when immediately afterward he died of a heart attack. To make things more eerie, his final score in the game was 16,660. Take away the first and final number, and you are left with 666. So, We have 2 deaths caused by heart attacks immediately after playing the ominous game Berzerk. Could this have been the work of Evil Otto? Well, not quite. There is a bit more to the story. Although the story of Peter Bukowski makes it seem odd that such a healthy young kid could have died from a heart attack just from playing a video game, the reality is that his health may not have been as great as you'd think. Bukowski was feeling not so great even before he arrived at the arcade. Before going to the arcade, he complained to one of his friends that he was feeling out of breath and thirsty. He stopped at a convenience store to drink a soda, but the problem persisted even when he got to the arcade. However, he insisted on playing Berzerk. It was only after 2 games that his problem became fatal. According to the autopsy report, Bukowski's heart was covered in scar tissue from undiagnosed pediatric cardiomyopathy. This disease can be fatal even to children and teenagers if left untreated. It's particularly problematic because it often doesn't show any symptoms until the heart gives out after doing something physically demanding. Bukowski treading through the snow for miles to get to the arcade, drinking all that caffeine from the soda, and finally, the intensity of scoring 2 high scores in Berzerk in just 20 minutes was enough for his heart to finally give in. The autopsy reports even showed that Bukowski had a mild heart attack 3 weeks before he died, without even knowing it. His life was just counting down. If Berzerk didn't kill him, something else surely would have eventually. It was nothing more than misfortune that led to his demise. But what about Jeffrey Dailey? It's a little odd that a second person died from Berzerk as well, and looking at his menacing arcade score doesn't make the story any less eerie. But that's really all this may be, a story. There's very little known about Jeffrey Dailey. I wasn't able to find any reliable sources mentioning Dailey's death. The earliest mention I could find of it was on arcadehistory.com, but even they don't give many details, nor do they list a source. The reality is, this probably didn't even happen, especially when you look at some inconsistencies in the story. Legend has it, Dailey played the game for hours before reaching a score of 16,660. A good Berzerk player could reach a score of 16,000 within 20 minutes, so imagine what they would achieve in hours. The closest you'll find supporting this story is an obituary of a 19-year-old kid named Jeffrey Dailey that died in 1981. However, he died in a car crash, not from playing Berzerk. Things still don't end here. There was one final Berzerk-related death that shocked people. On March 21st, 1988, a 17-year-old boy named Edward Clark Jr. entered Friar Tuck's game room. After playing a few games, he made his way over to the Berzerk machine, the same machine that Bukowski died at only 6 years earlier. There were a few unguarded coins on top of the machine, so he took one and popped it into the Berzerk coin slot. This is when a 16-year-old kid named Pedro Roberts claimed the coins were his, and demanded that Clark get off the game. After arguing back and forth for a bit, Roberts became physically aggressive, which eventually led to security kicking them both out. Roberts was kicked out first, and 10 minutes later, Clark could leave. Clark was urged to walk a different way than Roberts had gone, to avoid any further confrontation. This advice could have saved Clark's life, but unfortunately, he didn't listen. Roberts, being the violent, impulsive person he was, waited in an alley for Clark to walk by. As Clark unsuspectingly walked by, Roberts stabbed Clark in the chest with a knife. After being rushed to the hospital, Clark was declared dead. And that's where the story of Berzerk ends. If it truly was Evil Otto taking the lives of these people, then he never struck again. Berzerk will always be a game that stands out, holding the title of being the first arcade game linked to a death. It's no surprise why this legend is so well known. In terms of being realistic, it trumps other legends like Polybius simply because of how much of the legend is based off true events. When you take into consideration the hundreds of thousands of people who played Berzerk, and the mere 2 people whose deaths coincided with the game, it becomes unlikely that this had anything to do with some otherworldly forces. Unfortunate accidental deaths happen all the time, and Berzerk just happened to be the game to take credit for a few of them. For that, the game will continue to be remembered for many years to come. Thank you for watching, and I will see you on the flip side.